the way he translated it was such a simplified version. It wasn't the King James flowery language that is, of course, King James English, Shakespearean English, but instead was just a word-for-word translation of a real old text, and it made it really interesting to see. Well, I used to bring that book to class, and I used to pass it around and let everybody, have a look at it and so on. And the one time I did that in class, the book never came back. Someone in the class stole it. That's kind of annoying, right? So I complained to a colleague, Professor Auclair, who I was standing with Father Elliott. We were over at the new temple at the Latter-day Saints when they first built that in town, and before they opened it for services and everything, they instead had it open for the public to come in and see much of it, not all of it. But so I was there, and I was standing in line behind it, and I told her what happened, and she said, "Oh, well, that's not that good a book. You should get this." So I did. So I got the book by Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, and it was fascinating. And he basically gives you the idea that there's different traditions that were combined in the sacred scripture. And the first tradition is the Yahwist tradition. And so that's in the Torah. Let's see here. So the first one is the Yahwist tradition. And that one is from the most, I think the northern, so this is the southern part, Judah, right? So Yahwist is tradition. And then the second tradition is the book of E, which comes from the northern area, and that uses the name Elohim, or El, right? So El is actually God. Elohim is the plural for God. And excuse me, God bless you. And the story goes that Abraham is out in the desert. He has left his home city of Ur of the Chaldees, and he's left because of how corrupt the town was. God tells him to leave. So he leaves. He's got his families, his flocks, etc., with him. And the Elohim come. And there's at least 3 of them, apparently. So it's plural, and yet it's God. So God comes to him, and he feasts them with a dinner and everything, and they have a nice time. And the Elohim thank him for the dinner, and so bless him by saying that his heirs will inherit all this land. And by the way, his wife, who's nearby, overhears them promise that, and she laughs at God, famously. That's Sarai, or Sarah. And she laughs at God because she's postmenopausal, and Abraham doesn't have any children. So it's not like, no, that's not going to happen. But Abraham takes her seriously and insists that he wants to have a child. And so she offers Hagar, her slave girl, as a concubine for her husband. And so he ends up having a child, his first child, by Hagar, her name is, right? And Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, which is God hears him, right? So Ishmael. But then, surprise, surprise, Sarah becomes pregnant and ends up having a child, and that child is Isaac, right? So he's got these 2 kids. Well, here's the interesting part of the story. At some point, God comes to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, up the hill and sacrifice him to me. Abraham is horrified. Have you all heard this story? Yes? So Abraham takes his son, takes the rope, takes the knife, takes the bundle of wood or whatever, and goes up. And Isaac said, well, the son, let me fix that. The son says, Dad, you brought the knife, you brought the wood, etc., but you didn't bring the animal for sacrifice. And of course, the father then ties up his son, so famously, he's bound, right? Isaac is bound and put on the altar, and Abraham is about to slay him when, lo and behold, Gabriel comes and stops him, and he notices there's a ram stuck in the bushes, and he realizes, aha, reprieve. He doesn't have to kill his son. Well, here's an interesting part that's still relevant today. Jewish tradition says that son was Isaac. But Arab tradition says that son was Ishmael. And Ishmael is the ancestor of the Arabs. And, of course, Isaac is the ancestor of the Jews. So, who gets all the land? Which, of course, is Palestine, right? So if you think about it, people are still fighting over that land today, and both sides argue that God gave us this land, that God promised us this land. And it depends on your interpretation of which son it was. If it's the only son, well, the only son wouldn't that have had to have been Ishmael? Well, the Jewish tradition says no, Ishmael wasn't a legitimate son. So you can see that there's a relevance to this. The third tradition, and you can see the dates that he associates with these traditions, is roughly around 620 BC, and that is the Deuteronomy tradition. So once you add the Deuteronomist onto it, you end up with a larger book with all the laws, really, are from that. And then the people are taken away in the Babylonian captivity. Not all of them. The Samaritans escape and they stay home. And that causes all kinds of problems later on. But at this point, the people have been captured in Babylon, and lots of things happen to them there. But eventually they leave, and now they have the priestly post-exilic ritual focused on other laws and so on. And finally there's a redactor, and the redactor is the one that puts them all together closer to what the text actually still has today. Of course, we've ended up since then finding the text in Qumran. I don't know if you've heard of those, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're still finding things from there. That the scrolls that I mentioned earlier were a latter find they found in one of the caves, and so on. So they're still finding stuff. The neatest thing about it is they could use DNA in order to, because apparently when the Romans found these caves where all these jars of the text were hidden, because they were trying to protect them from the Romans went in and smashed them, smashed all the pieces up. Well, the neat thing is with DNA, they can take the goat skins, sheep skins, and figure out this one goes with this. So they've been compiling them and figuring out what those scrolls were. So that's kind of neat too. Okay, so what kinds of things? Well, Abraham, apart from that story, we end up with Isaac having sons, and the sons end up with their own stories. They end up becoming part of Egypt for a while, and of course that's where Moses, I mentioned, apparently was there at the time of Akhenaten. That's a thesis, at least, and so at that point they became monotheists. And so Moses is considered to be a monotheist, and that was if you're you're familiar with Freud. Freud on Moses. That book is actually online, so you're always welcome to read that if you find it interesting. It's a very short book, actually. I think I mentioned that one of my friends felt that it was actually Freud's best book. So there's the connection with Moses. Moses the Egyptian is another more recent book, by the way. That's by Jan Asman. Spelled it right. So there's an updated version of this. So they're still working on it. And of course, not everyone agrees. That would be crazy if everyone agreed on something like this. But in any case, it's interesting. So we end up with a sacred scripture. Moses is supposedly the one who wrote the Torah. As you can tell, they're not at all in agreement that Moses wrote all of it. That was the original tradition, that Moses was the author of the first 5 books. And you know that the Christian tradition includes the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And in fact, you might argue that Christianity is a Jewish sect, because Jesus was Jewish, born in Nazareth. Oops, where was he born? Bethlehem is the tradition. That's always been a puzzle because, well, what's the problem? Well, he was from Nazareth. Why would he have been born in Bethlehem? Well, the story says that Caesar insisted that everybody go to the town of their ancestors to register for the tax. Well, the Romans kept good historical records, and there's no record of Caesar ever asking that. Caesar never wanted to know that. He wanted to know where you were, because he wanted to tax you where you were, not where you were, somehow originally from. So a lot of scholars feel like that story was totally bogus, invented later. And why was it invented? Well, the argument was that the cave in Bethlehem was famous. Why? Apparently, Sargon the Great was born there, maybe. I've asked, and there's disagreements over this too. In fact, the one author, John Dominic Crossan, who I'll mention. If I overwhelm you, I'm sorry. It's so many interesting things, and I've been interested in this so long. Of course. So there's several books that John Dominic Crossan, John Dominic Crossan was a Roman Catholic priest at one time. But in his books, he talks about Bethlehem being a famous place. And if you were going to be a famous god, you basically needed to have all these things that you've experienced, like being born in the famous place. So his argument is that this story seems to have come up later, and not by a real historical description of Jesus' life, but instead Jesus was obviously born in this cave, because that's where everybody that was fantastic, religiously, spiritually, was born. And in fact, John Dominic Crossan argues that at the time of Jesus' birth, that cave would have been a gift shop where people could buy statues of Sargon the Great. I've asked about that, and not everybody agrees that that's the case. Of course, today, if you go to that cave, it's a church. They've got a church over it, and they say this is where Jesus was born, etc. There's other stories associated with the birth, like the Magi, the 3 Magi, right? The wise men coming to pay him homage. And it's kind of funny because you see up until one of the last translations of the Bible that fixed this, by the way, or actually the New Testament fixed this, and that was that they were wise men, magi from Iran, basically, Persia, right? That's where the magician, they're Zoroastrian priests, actually, right? And so they saw his star in the east, and so they followed it